Good morning, everyone, from Brussels on your smartphones and notebooks. This is FECC, the European Association of Chemical Distributors, and we have an exciting 1 hour together ahead of us with a lot of insights on the European and Asian industry, which is really in turmoil. And we can tap the big expertise of two brilliant speakers that are very well known to the community and who will provide us a lot of insights on what to expect from 2024. I can promise you this hour will be well invested. Before I introduce Will and John, and we go into the topic, let me quickly introduce FECC because we have a big mixed audience here today. So we are the only European association in Brussels here representing all chemical segments under one umbrella, literally from fuels and petrochemicals to life sciences, which we define as cosmetics, food and feed, and pharmaceuticals. We represent all company sizes, so that's also pretty unique. We have startups on board and also multinationals. And we take care of all chemical supply chain functions. And a lot of our members are small and medium-sized enterprises, and a lot of them also family-owned businesses. So this is very special. And if I talk about all supply chain functions, then this gives you a little bit of a flavor. We're talking about not exclusively, but for example, of warehousing, recycling, formulating and blending, research and development, technical and regulatory advice, especially for clients who don't have chemists in the house, and these are quite a lot. And we also do partially logistics and packaging. So that's a bit us as the association hosting this webinar together with ICIS. The chemical distribution sector in Europe stands for more than 30,000 highly qualified jobs. And of course, if we count the many multiplier effects along the value chain, in addition to that, then we end up with 4 times as many highly qualified jobs. We add every year something like 28 to 30 billion annual sales. I said already, we are placed in midst of all chemical value chains, which of course means everything which is happening right-hand side and left-hand side from us in the supply chain is hitting us sooner or later. And the rest, I think I have already mentioned. So we are hosting regular events, and I also would like to invite everyone in the audience very warmly to a very special one we will host on 8th of March on diversity and inclusion in the chemical sector in the whole range of facets, but of course, since it is International Women's Day, we will keep a special eye on women in the chemical value chain. So I warmly invite you. You find more details on LinkedIn and also on our homepage. And of course, last but not least, a lot of insights will be provided in, and that is meanwhile a tradition, during our upcoming annual Congress, which will take place from Wednesday 11th to Friday 13th of September in ICIS, close to Barcelona. So I warmly recommend and invite you to also attend this event. Without further ado, let me do 2 minutes of housekeeping before I introduce the speakers. So first of all, you will get the presentations from John and Will, and if you wish to have a bilateral follow-up or special questions or would like to have more insights from ICIS, please contact the 2 speakers. You will find their contact details at the end of their presentations. Specifically today, and that is an exception to the rule, but we found so much interest in the webinar, we will also record it. So just for your information, and we will also make the recording available. ICIS will do the same on our channels. Of course, we would like to make it as interactive as possible, which means we would like you to send in a lot of questions, hopefully, to John and to Will. If you have somebody in mind of the 2 who you wish to answer the question, then it would be easier for us if you tag John or Will, so I can direct the questions to you. You can submit the questions via clicking the dashboard on your right-hand side. There you see a little button called questions, or sometimes a question mark. Then a little chat box opens up. You type in your question, which will come out here and in Brussels. We don't mention your name. I will read them out anonymously, and then John and Will answer them. Please make use of the opportunity. We don't always have such a broad knowledge with us, especially in the morning. So, and that means without further ado, let me quickly introduce the two speakers of today. Actually, both of them are very well known. I think maybe you know them already. So, but nevertheless, for those who might not know Will Beecham and John Richardson, so Will is deputy editor of ICIS Chemical Business, a weekly digest of the most important news and trends impacting the global chemical industry. Will has substantial experience also working for ICIS since 23 years in variety of editorial roles, and he also hosts the weekly ICIS Think Tank podcast. So, and then we have John Richardson, who is a senior consultant of ICIS for Asia Pacific specifically, also based in Australia. So for him, it's very late in the evening. He is a highly experienced trainer and chemicals industry analyst who has been working in the industry for 18 years. John has a deep knowledge of the companies and people who have transformed the region into the world's major production and consumption region, and in particular about China, which will for sure be also a big topic of today. So warm welcome to you, gentlemen, to Will and to John. It's a pleasure to have you on board, and the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dorothy. Oh, hello, everyone. Thanks to you all for joining today. I'm Will Beecham, as Dorothy said. I'm deputy editor at ICIS Chemical Business, and I do have this think tank podcast which Dorothy mentioned, and Dorothy has appeared on it, and I'd welcome more subscribers, more listeners, so you can find us on any of the channels. Search for ICIS Chemicals podcasts. I've been writing about chemicals since 2000, so I've charted the changing fortunes of the regions since then. Next slide, please. Okay, so well, today I'm going to focus on Europe's petrochemical sector, while John's going to drill down into what's going on in Asia, especially China, and how it affects the rest of the world. As you all be aware, Europe's chemical sector is in a very challenged and fragile state. So firstly, I want to describe the issues and trends that have created these difficult conditions. Next, what impact this combination of troubles has had on the industry. I'll show you how operating rates have slumped, while a wave of temporary and permanent closures has caused production of chemicals in Europe to collapse back to 1999 levels. Then we'll take a look at what's going on in the Red Sea and how this new bottleneck is improving the situation for some producers, albeit temporarily, down some value chains. And finally, I want to examine some scenarios for Europe and ask how the industry can find positive ways to thrive in the future. Next slide, please. So firstly, to the macroeconomic backdrop. Here you can see the euro area GDP since 2020 and our forecast out to the end of 2025. As you can see, the cost of living crisis is still hurting consumer demand. Record-breaking inflation has cooled a bit, but interest rates remain at record levels, and the net result is less money in people's pockets and prohibitive borrowing costs. This means people are focusing on the basics and avoiding big ticket purchases in important end-use markets for chemicals. This includes autos, construction, and electronics. Supply chains have been going through the longest period of destocking in 30 years, and there's no end in sight yet. So what we see is continued and persistent poor downstream demand for chemicals, with devastating effects on company earnings too. Next slide, please. So our gas analysts at ICIS track market developments closely, and the red line on the graph shows the ICIS TTF European gas benchmark. The blue line is the pre-war average price. You can see the massive ramp up in gas costs, which followed the start of Russia's war with Ukraine. Europe had enjoyed access to cheap and plentiful Russian gas for decades, but with this almost cut off and insufficient storage and import facilities, there were fears the continent would run out literally of gas. So Prices spiked to almost 15 times the long-term average, and the effect on the chemical industry was pretty devastating, as you'll see. Now a combination of mild weather, depressed industrial demand, ample storage and good global availability of LNG. And now costs and prices are heading back towards pre-war levels. However, risks remain from planned and unplanned outages and political uncertainty. This year sees more than 2 billion voters head to the polls in 50 countries. Polling takes place in major gas producing or consuming countries, all regions such as India, Russia, Indonesia, the EU, the US, and potentially the UK. Next slide, please. Well, for the longer term, there is potentially good news on gas costs, and gas, of course, is an important as a feedstock and also a source of energy for chemical production. There's a huge wave of almost 200 million tonnes a year of new LNG capacity scheduled to enter the market, and this will add 50% to global capacity by 2030. This is likely to benefit Europe, which has become much more reliant on LNG imports since we lost almost all of our Russian supplies. Here's a good quote on the slide there from our gas expert, Arasabidis, who said, certainly next year and the year after, I would assume that prices would fall, perhaps not to the level of 2020, but probably below 20 euros per megawatt hour. Next slide, please. So where does this leave Europe? Well, the region relies mainly on naphtha as a feedstock for petrochemical production. The Middle East and the US, however, crack ethane, which gives those regions an immediate advantage unless oil prices are very low. So this is the ICIS cost curve, which places all the crackers in the world in order, with the lowest cost of production to the left and the highest to the right. The green lines on the chart represent Europe's cracker fleet. As you can see, they're much less competitive than almost half of the global cracker fleet. To the left are the Middle East and US-based ethane crackers. To the right are almost entirely Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean facilities. It's easy to see how Europe remains under intense competitive pressure from a cost point of view, despite falling energy costs. Next slide, please. So, if by any chance you are already feeling sorry for European chemical producers, this will make you feel worse. From 2023 onwards, a massive wave of new petrochemical capacity has been coming on stream, led by China. And John will tell you much more about this in more detail later. As these new plants come on stream, they want to gain market share in export markets because their local domestic market is so flat, with Europe being an obvious target. So there's increasing oversupply, a poor macroeconomic environment globally, and together this is going to be a major cause of disruption to chemical markets for the rest of the decade. Next slide, please. So all the factors I've discussed so far, depressed demand, high production costs, and global overcapacity, have had a devastating effect on chemical capacity utilization or operating rates in Europe. And this graph shows you what's happened to operating rates in Europe. Since 2022, chemical companies have aimed to reduce losses by cutting back on capacity utilization, often to technical minimal levels, or by closing plants completely. The latest figures for December 2023 show rates at an unsustainable 59%. You can't make money running at plants that low. It normally needs to be sort of 75, 80% plus two to start being profitable. Next slide, please. So Europe's petrochemical sector has been shrinking steadily since the Russia-Ukraine war and the cost of living crisis began. And this graph shows you chemical production in Europe since 1997. You can see that last year output fell into the biggest trough since the 2008-9 financial crisis. The difference here is that then there was a powerful bounce back and growth driven by a huge stimulus in China, which helped to revive the whole global economy. This time round, we can't rely on China to sort the economy out. So production has come out of the trough slightly, thanks to those lower gas costs, and it's steady, but now at a much lower level. In fact, not levels that we haven't seen since 1999. Next slide, please. So the run-up in gas costs plus poor demand has resulted in a wave of temporary capacity closures or cuts to operating rates. At ICIS, we've created a map of the closures based on feedback from our pricing editorial team, which we update every week. This map was updated last Wednesday, and you can see that a substantial amount of capacity remains off stream. This includes a lot of fertilizer plants, which use natural gas as a key feedstock, accounting for up to 80% of variable production costs. Next slide, please. So here we can see the outages expressed as a timeline with millions of tons on the vertical axis and the years on the horizontal axis. You can see the sharp rise in production brought offline or reduced from early 2022. As gas costs have come down, low demand and competition, especially from Asia, have become the key reasons for the continuing and persistent outages, which haven't really fallen for the last several months. Next slide, please. And a final word on the gas low demand situation. Here we can see which chemicals are most affected, and this graph does exclude fertilizers, most fertilizers. The graph shows the percentage of European production most heavily impacted. The chemical DMT leads the pack with 100% still offline or at reduced capacity, followed by acetone at more than 50%. These products will be the most exposed to gas costs or low demand and or competition from Asia. Next slide, please. So now let's have a quick word about the disruption to logistics caused by the attacks on ships in the Red Sea, which has been a hot topic here at ICIS for a while now, since the end of last year. So most major shipping groups are now avoiding the Suez Canal and diverting their ships around the Cape of Good Hope. This adds around 15 days to the typical journey. It removes capacity from the system and is causing delays to imports from Asia and the Middle East to Europe, as well as increasing the prices, the costs of transportation. We mustn't forget that the canal is not closed, but that the number of transits through it has fallen significantly. The latest figures we've got show that 41 ships a day went through the canal on the 13th of February 2024, compared with 72 on the same day the year before. And those figures are on a 7-day rolling average. So Europe relies heavily on imports from Asia and the Middle East for some product groups. Top of the list is PTA, purified terephthalic acid, a key feedstock for PET production. Europe imports 80% of its requirements from Asia and the Middle East. And then after that, between 40 and 50% of epoxy resins, ABS and MMA, methyl methacrylate, are also imported from the Middle East and Asia. Next slide, please. So with imports disrupted, many buyers in Europe are now switching to more local sourcing. In some value chains, there are outages in Europe, and the combination of lower import flows and local outages has tightened supply. And all this has made purchasing managers feel a bit uneasy, the ones that we speak to here at ICIS. So to ensure security of supply, they're building safety stocks. This is happening all the way down value chains, causing what one polyethylene producer calls a bullwhip effect. This tightening of supply and demand dynamics has already pushed up margins for some product groups, even though real underlying demand has not improved. This graph shows margins for Europe HDPE rising, which is the orange line, while overcapacity in China drives Northwest Asia margins into negative territory. Next slide, please. Finally, a few words on future prospects for Europe. which will tie in with John's analysis later. I've described, as you've heard, a very bleak situation for the region's petrochemical sector, hammered by high costs, poor demand, and global overcapacity led by China. But here are some scenarios which might help secure the industry's future. The low carbon agenda favours local or regional supply chains over global ones, so there could be opportunities for innovative players to get more involved with recycling or with more small-scale manufacturing of low carbon products or local markets. Protectionism is already on the rise as governments seek to protect local manufacturing supply chains from intense global competition. This competition is only going to get more intense, especially in chemicals, as you saw from the slide earlier. So we can expect more moves by the EU and the US, for example, against Chinese imports. Low carbon legislation, such as the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, may also protect the region from imports of cheaply made high carbon products. And finally, let's not forget that Europe is a sophisticated, wealthy market of 449 million people. So if Europe's chemical industry can respond dynamically to its changing needs, its future may be secured. Last slide, please. So thanks for listening. I'm going to hand over to John Richardson next, and then we'll take your questions at the end. Thanks very much.
Right, thanks, Will. So thanks, everybody. I've been doing this now for 27 years, actually. To move on to the first slide. Next slide, please. And this is the biggest oversupply crisis the industry has faced, right? That's the first thing too. Will was talking about supply disruptions, but as he said, underlying demand is the issue. And so, I mean, margins may have improved marginally in some regions, but the oversupply is massive. And what we have here are the 6 big petrochemical building blocks, the monomers, and it's everything downstream of those monomers, right? So it's equivalent demand. And I took a demand away from capacity in this chart here, selected years, all the years, obviously from 1990. You see this huge overcapacity of 218 million tons last year, about 290 million tons of excess capacity this year. So why? Well, people have got China wrong. The people thought that China would grow at 6 to 8% a year, is chemicals demand growth in general. But because of the changes that I've been discussing and warning about for years now, that it's going to be 1 to 3%, right? And it's the gap between the expectations of growth at 6 to 8%, which led to all this overcapacity now globally, versus what's really going to happen, because people built capacity on the assumption that China will grow at those levels because China dominates global demand. That explains it. Also, the mistake they made was they assumed that China would not build the capacity it said it was going to build. And China over time has always built capacity for social and political reasons, and not just for cost per ton reasons. And they looked at the cost per ton analysis of some of the projects and said, no, they won't happen. But the argument, my argument for a long time, based on talking to the industry, has been saying, no, that's not the case. That China adds capacity because it's social and political. So now we have all this capacity that Will talked about in China. Minor reasons, pandemic, inflation, but they're really minor in comparison. So if we go on to the next chart, this kind of explains the context of what's happened in China and where we're heading. This is per capita polymers consumption for the 9 big synthetic resins. And it's divided into 3 mega regions. China itself is a mega region, then the developing world outside China. And the green line in the middle is China. The light blue line at the top is the developed world, and dark blue line is developing world. You see, in 1992, developing world and China were pretty close together. Then we had Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour, which is economic liberalization, focused on export-focused manufacturing, all those young people moving to the cities to make stuff for exports to the West primarily. And then whoosh, a big change was 2001. When China joined the World Trade Organization, all the tariffs and quotas that have restricted exports to the West were removed. So now suddenly China is filling Walmart and Target with washing machines. because they can, and they've got really low labour costs. But the population was ageing by 2009 as we go through this period of history. And this is when they launched this enormous economic stimulus package. So the focus then was on domestic demand, but really concentrated in real estate and some super rich people who made a lot of money. I mean, the Pew Research Center came out with something a few months ago that in 2020, only 23 million Chinese earned more than $50 a day. So get away from the idea that China is a middle-class country by Western standards. The data does not support that conclusion. It's still a very poor country with some super rich people, right? and a thriving middle class, but still relatively very poor. So it was stimulus that drove this consumption. And of course, a lot was re-exports of these polymers as well. And you know, to do with the export trade remains important. And it's gone bust because from late 2001, the Evergrande crisis, the end of the property bubble, the demographics get worse every year. And it's been building and building and building. People are saving more money. Healthcare costs or savings are going up to meet those rising costs because of the rising number of dependents. Very poor pension healthcare system in China. Really big problems with the stock market as well as real estate now, the lack of confidence, and geopolitics, the split with the West. So I think, you know, China's entered a period of much lower growth for longer, for a long time. Go to the next chart, which is turning this now into tons of demand versus population, millions of tons. Extraordinarily, you will see the chart after this, which is really shocking, but back in 1992, China, from 1.2 billion people, consumed 6 million tons of these polymers. Developing world, 3.2 billion, 14 million. Developed world, a lot richer, 58 million, 1 billion. So go into the next slide, and this is jaw-dropping, really is, if we go to the next slide. That, as of 2022, it was up to 107 million tons of demand from 1.4 billion people. Actually, it might be 1.3. There are issues around how the population is being measured in China, and it's a declining population. 107 million tons compared to 84 million tons from 5.3 billion, 82 from the developed world of 1.1. So China is overconsumed, and there are a couple of major producers who talk about dematerialization now, that China's growth might go negative from 2030 or thereabouts because it's gone up by too much. The middle bar's a potential, isn't it, right? The developing world outside China, I think the population by 2050, 7 billion, I think I read, for the developing world outside China. So you think that 84 million has got a lot of potential to go up. Developed world, well, sustainability, I think, you know, it's probably plateaued, aging population, etc. Go on to the next slide. This encapsulates why we place problems, right, in our data. Show we're expecting global ethylene operating rates to average 79% out to 2030. Historically, they've been fantastic. This industry's made marvelous money, 88% from 1990 to 2023. So I just did a very simple, you know, mathematical exercise using our data, assuming the same demand for ethylene and its derivatives, right? What would it take to get back to an 88% operating rate using our base case for demand? And I simply just cut capacity out, or cut capacity growth out. So to get back to 88%, capacity growth can only be 800,000 tons a year, 2024 and 2030, versus our base case is 7 million tons a year of capacity growth. So that means plant closures, guys. That's what it means. And it's going to be potentially in Europe, South Korea, Singapore, Japan. They are the real problem countries, really, and regions, really struggling. We know that the Middle East, the US, will carry on building. We'll talk about that in a moment. So their projects will happen. So this has placed more pressure on these other regions. If you go to the next slide, I've done the same for propylene, exactly the same. So to get back to historically healthy operating rates, have to be just 2 million tons of capacity growth per year, compared with our 6.2 million under our base case. So these are shocking numbers. The scale of the correction that would need to happen. So it's going to be very painful potentially. But the next slide shows even the broader context. If we move to the next slide now, this I could spend hours on this, and it's probably the most important slide in the deck: super majors versus deglobalization. Now, critical to understand, despite this oversupply that we face today, Saudi Aramco is leading the oil and gas companies in wanting to add more petrochemical capacity. So you scratch your head, as Will said, margins are low. Why would they want to do that? Well, the reason is because of declining crude oil demand. And Aramco, obviously owned by the Saudi government, wants to protect crude oil production. And this is existential for the kingdom, isn't it? Because IEA figures about fuel efficiency, biofuels, electric vehicles, they cannot afford to leave that crude in the ground. So we have a raft of already announced what we call crude oil to chemical projects, which is a more sophisticated refinery configuration, whereby instead of producing, say, 30 to 45% of feedstock for chemicals from a refinery output, they can go to 60% and eventually 80%. So the idea is we turn that oil into chemicals in order to protect oil demand. We've got, as you will see in a moment, next slide, not yet, later on, look at all the new capacities being planned elsewhere, the oil and gas, well, by the oil and gas giants. I mean, they've got a lot of ethane crackers. So in the super majors scenario on your left there, the super majors, by 2030, you need to plan for a scenario where the global industry is dominated by a few oil and gas majors. Right? Fewer companies will be around. They've built these massive capacities, causing even more dislocation for the other producers than indicated by the earlier charts on ethylene and propylene, which do not take into account capacities yet to be announced. They cannot, can they? The potential is a lot more capacity that could be announced before 2030 and built, right? I think there's other important implications to this super majors world. Recycled polymers don't work because you have lots of virgin polymer coming in. It's very cheap. That the MRFs can't get money for the bales. That the brand owners under sort of the pressure. Well, why should we use recycled polymers when virgin is so cheap? That's the challenge for Europe, right? What in this scenario happens to recycling, but also the carbon issue that that Will alluded to here. The carbon issue is, obviously got the CBAM in Europe. You've got the carbon trading system. That Aramco is pushing through carbon capture and storage. It's new complexes. It's turning from fuel oil to renewables in its power plants. It's talking about electric furnaces. So potentially under this outcome of super majors, we end up with lots of exports from the Middle East and elsewhere into Europe of very low carbon polymer, which beats the local producers who have a far higher carbon reduction cost if the CBAM is not advantageous to local producers, basically. You also say that in the US under the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a carbon capture and storage hub in Houston and in Saskatchewan in Canada. The Net Zero project there by Dow, that's got a carbon capture facility nearby. So, the US or North America rather is also going for lower carbon for export. Right? But it might not be like this. It might end up in a deglobalized world by 2030 because I get confusing figures here. I'm told that one job in petrochemicals equals 5, 6, 7, 8 jobs downstream. I don't know how many, but clearly, there's a multiple of people employed as a result of that one person in petrochemicals or refining. So the government's realised, well, we've got to protect the economy. The economies. We've got to protect local fuel supply. We know that refineries are closing in Europe for electrification, but you still need local supplies of gas, diesel, and kerosene, right? And refineries can't run without that naphtha offtake. Plus, they will decide we need to hit our recycling targets, right? We can't, be beholden to this imports of really cheap virgin polymer. We need to protect ourselves. And it could be, as Will was saying, that local for local is an argument you make in terms of reducing carbon more effectively. So it's very much about the arguments you make now in this story, I think, and how the producers engage with the industry associations, etc. It's the arguments you make and the data that support those arguments. But I think regardless, there are 4 things that are going to happen. whether we end up with deglobalization, super majors. These are extremes, right? Extremes, we may end up somewhere in between the two. That's likely, isn't it? But we could, we do face these record levels of oversupply. This, you know, despite that recent tightness that Will was talking about. I've listed the areas that are really struggling. No more big volume imports by China in PE, PP, PX, and MEG, right? By 2030. China's going to get to self-sufficiency, pretty much, balanced position, right? So those huge export markets disappear. And the aging population in China, the demographic stuff I've been talking about for a long time in the West, sustainability, the climate crisis. I like to call it the climate crisis now, not climate change. They're negatives for growth of petrochemicals in general, but there are some positives that come out of this as well, which we could discuss in more detail. And then, because of events in Ukraine, in the Middle East, I think we've probably seen the end of the post-Berlin Wall peace dividend, where defence spending went down, creating more money for infrastructure and welfare. I think defence spending will likely increase now, I'm afraid. So these are the two mega scenarios, and these are the four things that will happen. Now let's just go into a little bit more detail. We'll move on to the next slide, please. Need to explain a bit more detail about these scenarios. So these are the winners, and I've listed here the cracker projects that have been announced that we know of. The crude oil to chemicals includes the Shaheen project in the Middle East. That's an Aramco subsidiary, S-Oil. Sabic Gulia, of course, Aramco and Sabic have merged. That's a crude oil to chemicals project, as is Ras Al Khaimah, rather, at the bottom there. Right? But there's many more that could be announced. The numbers here are quite staggering. If you look at the headline announcement from Aramco, they want to convert up to 4 million barrels of liquids into chemicals, barrels a day, 4 million barrels a day of liquids into chemicals by 2030. 1 million barrels a day of that's already operating. That leaves 3 million barrels a day more, 1.5 in the kingdom, 1.5 overseas. If you do the maths versus what we know about capacity, there could be a 28 million tons a year more ethylene by 2030 if they hit that target than we know of, and a further 16 million tons more propylene than we know of, and a lot more aromatics as well. It's very heavy, these feedstocks. Of course, it's oil going into oil to chemicals, so it's the full range of products. It's not ethane cracking, of course. So that's the scale of the potential extra capacity. Then we have, you know, the ethane crackers like Baruch, Golden Triangle, the US. So these are very advantaged again. Fort Saskatchewan I mentioned, they'll be advantaged. The Q80 program project down there, I think, is integrated with a refinery. But so a lot of ethane cracking as well, potentially coming on stream. So move on to the next slide. And so who's going to struggle in this scenario? Well, I think really depends on, you know, the value of the petrochemical industry in Europe, like I said, and how that's perceived and how that's perceived by the legislators. What's important? But clearly, you know, this is just HTP in Europe in 2022. We've talked about this for years, and Europe's done superbly well to replace furnaces, better integration. It's made its industry work really well. But people are now saying because of the age of the assets, cost of carbon abatement, like I said, which is high. And the other thing we've got to worry about is that these crude oil to chemicals projects, 60% of their output is chemicals on average, we reckon. 40% is still fuel products. So that's very, very worrying, isn't it? That, you know, we could suddenly get, you know, markets flooded by cheap Group 3 base oils, for example. A lot of Group 3 base oils. So that's putting more pressure on refiners in Europe, and therefore you think maybe they'll have to shut down earlier than had been expected with electrification. It's a longer term threat. But I mean, Singapore, South Korea, what's their rationale? I mean, they export most of they're very export based. You know, most of their production is exports. Most of their exports go to China. So the situation where China becomes self-sufficient, you know, it's a tough one. And again, age of assets, carbon abatement costs. I mean, it's pretty new investments in Singapore and South Korea, but compared with what's been built in the Middle East, it's going to be older in comparison. So if you go into the next slide, and the winners, JVs in China, right? On the previous slide, I had BASF, by the way. There's one of the crackers being built. BASF is this is going to be running entirely on renewable energy. Right? So it ticks the green box. BASF chemistry, petrochemistry, it's all higher value stuff, which the Chinese very keen to encourage domestically because that enables them to escape their middle income trap. It helps them increase the value of their economy to justify higher wage costs as it's an aging society. So that all fits. For the Aramcos and SABICs, it's about helping China get to self-sufficiency. It's a win-win. They get to place crude oil in China, guarantee their crude oil production. China gets to achieve its strategic petrochemical objectives. Shell, that's a crown jewel of Shell Chemicals, right? The CNOT joint venture. I mean, so, yes, we're negative about China growth. It's slowing down, maybe 1 to 3% a year, but there's still a lot of demand to be met by new local production. And there'll still be growth, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think dematerialization and negative growth is a stretch. So we'll still see growth from a bigger base, a much bigger base than 20 years, 30 years ago. So, but it'll be met by these guys, that's the point. Move on to the next slide. And this is just showing briefly, this chart shows our expectations under our base case of China's share of total net imports globally between 2023 and 2030, percentage shares that is. So our base case actually sees China still being a major net importer of these products by 2030, but we need other scenarios. And certainly the 15 5-year plan is not out yet. They're trying to get there. And the 15 5-year plan is for 2026 to 2030, including 2026. And the word is out there that they want to get to self-sufficiency under that plan. And they've seen it. They won't read the details of these slide out to you. You can read it yourselves later. But, they've done it before in other products. They've surprised at the pace in which they add capacity. Then we come into a scenario, will China be just a balanced position by 2030? No more major net imports apart from, shutdowns and unexpected demand? Or will there be a major exporter, net exporter? Don't know. The view is they probably will be more likely to be just in a balanced position, not a major exporter, but taking most of the imports they do need from the Middle East. So the next slide, please. And question mark winners. I think that the oil and gas companies, the smaller oil and gas companies, are regional players, big regional players. In fact, I'm here in Thailand this week to meet some of these producers. PTT, Samcement's not an oil and gas producer, but it's embedded in the local economy. PTT is very important to the local economy. Petronas is a semi-giant, if you like. A lot of oil and gas production and fertilizers and chemicals. Petro-Vietnam. Now, Petro-Vietnam, interestingly, Aramco are looking at investing in Vietnam in chemicals. Right? Re-examining a plan that was stalled a few years ago. So that will be win-win again, right? The Aramco invests in Vietnam, gets to place of crude oil. Vietnam expands its chemical capacity to meet big deficits, because it's a big import country, Vietnam, but nothing on the scale of China, which dominates global imports. So these could be the winners, right? And the next slide is, I think, very important for Europe. We want to the next slide. Recyclers, right? And this is just a picture of the recycling value chain. The problem is, how do we deal with these cheap virgin polymer prices coming to Europe? What do we do? That's the challenge. I think it's about policy levers, about looking how to make the MRFs, the recyclers, the brand owners. How do we incentivize people along the value chain to still produce, buy, recycle polymers when the virgin opportunities are so much better? I mean, in my country, Australia, where I live at the moment, the MRFs are losing money, right? They're having to pay to have the bales of sorted waste taken away because of the collapse of virgin prices. 12 months ago, they were making money from the bales. So how do you then incentivize the MRFs locally here to still supply the feedstock for the recyclers? What about brand owners again? You know, what's their incentive to switch to recycled, you know, material? And so, again, I think it's up to, in a deglobalization scenario, this works, right? Or maybe there's a somewhere in between where it's not deglobalization. You know, we do end up with a very much more competitive global market with cheap polymers because of all this Middle East capacity flowing around the world without major trade barriers, right? Under deglobalization, have major trade barriers. But maybe there are incentives that could be established that make the recycling industry work, very flexible policy levers, even under a sort of super majors world, if you like. So the final slide, please. I'll take any questions. Yeah, so this is my super majors deglobalization slide. I keep adapting this. It's about version 15 since last November. So it's work in progress. In fact, you know, I've got a workshop I'm doing in Vienna in April, if you're interested, where I'm going to be working on this in group situations with clients. But rigorous scenario planning, right? So you've got to plan for super majors or deglobalization and lots of scenarios in between. And what does it mean for your business, right? Your specific business, so we can support you doing that. ICIS can. I think, you know, this is very general, easy to say, harder to do, but I think we've gone past the age of demand being guaranteed. Tremendously strong demand growth is guaranteed because of what was happening in China, which dominated global demand, right? What's happening with aging populations, not just in China, but in the West, sustainability, and the climate crisis, all mean we're moving into a more challenged demand environment, the end of the peace dividend, all those things I was talking about. So we've got to be, you know, we can't just build capacity to serve demand. In the past, all you had to worry about was building big plants, cheap feedstock ideally, and good logistics to meet tremendously strong demand growth. That was guaranteed. Right? And I think we've gone beyond that. There'll be pockets of great demand. There'll be regions where demand is good. What happens in Africa, what happens in the rest of the developing world outside China, specific regions, and end-use markets, right? So what about wire and cable, low-density polyethylene in Europe, for example, with the growth of renewable energy, the need for more energy transmission? What does that look like? You know, how do we maximize production of that and link in with a real societal need and an environmental need, which is renewable energy? And I think there's lots of other examples that come out in discussions with clients where you think about specific end-use markets. The Middle East will not be making the range of grades that you can make on a European reactor with a maybe higher value technology, right? They'll go for the basic grade. So are there niche grade opportunities in Europe as well? So I'm saying it is quite shocking, the data, and it is quite doom and gloom at one level. But I think you've got to say, right, okay, it is what it is. Let's get on with it. We could end up in super majors world. How do we thrive? You know, what do we do to deal with this? So I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks very much for an excellent and extremely insightful, though a bit depressing, I would say, presentation. Will and John, as ever, is fantastic. So everyone who have a coffee this morning now got a lot of wake-up calls. And many thanks to everyone who submitted questions. Actually, we got a flurry of them, and we have only 10 minutes left. So those who came in first were the ones on the US situation, which I think you have answered in the flow of the presentation. It was a bit of on what is the effect of IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. You have mentioned that already, and I think you have elaborated that. So if the sender of this question has any specific aspects he or she wishes to explore, please specify, because otherwise, in the interest of time, I would turn to the other questions which were not fully dealt with in the presentation. So first of all, that goes to Will. and it's about the supply chain disruptions in the Red Sea. Could you please elaborate a little bit further on the impact of these supply chain disruptions on Egypt and neighboring countries of the Red Sea and Suez Canal?
Well, the Suez Canal, the problems in that part of the Red Sea have effectively cut off Asia and large parts of the Middle East from using the Suez Canal, and they've had to divert their cargoes all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. Whereas there are other chemical producers in the Middle East who are further down the Red Sea towards the Suez Canal, who can access the Suez Canal, but they can't send products back east because it's too dangerous. So those producers on the sort of south coast of Saudi Arabia are either having to truck their product across the desert to the north coast of Saudi Arabia to reach the Asian markets, or they just can't access the Asian markets and they're having to send products just through towards Europe. That answers the question.
And my understanding is the situation in Egypt is rather strange, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure the details what's happening in Egypt at the moment. Perhaps I could get back to the questioner later.
Okay, that would be fantastic. Thank you, Will. And, another question. Do you expect a strike back from other regions to EU protectionist measures? I think that refers to the CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism that you mentioned in the presentation, Will. So do you expect similar measures, countermeasures from other regions?
I think so. I don't see that the other regions would not respond in kind, really. I would have thought that China and the US would both probably put in measures, and other major economies too. And I think maybe because Europe likes to be the leader in low carbon legislation and moves, that's why they've been the first mover here. It's quite interesting, we don't have a date yet for inclusion of chemicals and polymers, but it could be any time after 2030, and the EU have made it clear that they want to include basically everything under CBAM eventually, so it will happen at some stage.
Yeah, one of our favorite topics, CBAM. Okay, thank you, Will. Then, yeah, that's a good question to both of you. What is the way out for petrochemical producers in Europe? Where's the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I mean, I think, go on, John, you go first.
I think, yeah, sorry, Will. I think it is sustainability, and it's carving out niches, recognizing, where you have a right to play, to use the corporate jargon. That in Europe, recycling could be big, right? The brand owners want it, the public seem to want it. We build this supply chain, it's got to work. I think that you've got to make a decision what's good for the industry in terms of the overall economy, and in terms of what's good for carbon. What's the best way of dealing with carbon? Is that local for local? I think those are the issues. And also, as I said, it's about individual grades, and we're linking with end use customers. Sort of easier said than done, Dorothy. It's like, but I think that's where it is, because we can't really deal with we can't control the impersonal forces beyond us, can we? Yeah. So we'll go.
Well, I was just going to say that well, we mustn't forget that Europe is a huge market. I put the figure on the presentation, and it's a very advanced market, a very wealthy market, and it's got increasing needs for sort of specialized, advanced materials. I think if the chemical companies in Europe can focus on innovation, don't cut the innovation budgets, even though profits are under pressure at the moment, then they've got a good chance of meeting that local demand, because they're such an essential part of the local supply chains in Europe. And I think also with all the disruptions in logistics, which seem to be popping up time, I think there's quite a good case for local purchasers down supply chains to prefer local chemical producers to supply their needs, rather than just relying on cheap imports from Asia. And the other thing I would add is that, well, protectionism's, it's already happening. You know, at the moment we've got EU anti-dumping duties and investigations on PET coming from China and other products too, and up and down supply chains as well. It's going to happen on potentially on Chinese electric vehicles, solar panels, and so on. So, you know, I think the EU is going to make sure that local supply chains can remain in a healthy situation. They'll do as much as they can. So there is hope. It's not all doom and gloom.
No, thank you. Thank you for making our days here. So, but we are not yet to the end. I still have some questions for you. So, interesting question. What happens to the mature petrochemical plants in Europe at the end of their life cycle?
Well, I suppose, Dorothy, that's a reason for them to. The cost of environmental cleanup is big, isn't it? If you shut these plants down, and how do you clean up the back to where it was before, which would be very difficult. Yeah. Don't know. I think that's a reason why they may carry on operating, right? But I know that there's things like biorefineries. You talk about biofeedstocks, did we? Is a way of moving to biofeedstocks for refineries and chemical production, which could help keep those old plants going. Recycling is always going to be a small scale industry, really, isn't it? Oh, I don't know. I mean, maybe chemical recycling can break out, right? The technically limiting at the moment, isn't it, in terms of capacity, scale. But all those things could keep the old industry going.
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with you, John. I think it's already happening that a lot of these refinery sites and chemical production sites, they're not just being abandoned, they're being used for low carbon chemical plants with renewable feedstocks or hydrogen. There's a big hydrogen complex being developed in Spain, where I'm based, with Cepsa leading that. And the hydrogen economy offers a lot of potential as well, and new infrastructure that might be needed for that. So I think that there'll be plenty of uses for these sites, and employment too, hopefully.
In the interest of time, because we actually have only 2 minutes left and we have 5 questions left. Really sorry for those who sent in their questions only last minute. I don't think we can cover them. Maybe I can motivate Will and John to answer them afterwards, and we share them with the participants. But let me try to at least get 2 out for you, and please answer them possibly as quickly as you can. Why does the European chemical industry not lobby for the European Central Bank in order to decrease the key interest rate? It's not sustainable to continue like this.
Well, they may well be lobbying. They may well be lobbying, but I don't think the central bank's going to listen to the chemical sector or anybody really. You know, they've got their set agenda, their obsession with cutting inflation, so they're going to do what they think is necessary.
Yeah. I mean, from the epicenter of lobbyism in Brussels, I would say the European Central Bank has the first and foremost target to fight inflation, and inflation is also detrimental to industry. I think that is a bit of that's an awkward kind of answer there, that we cannot lobby the European Central Bank. I mean, it's anyhow independent, and we are hit by inflation as we are hit by interest rates. So there's no easy way out. What is the potential impact of the Global Plastics Treaty? John, maybe in 1 or 2 sentences? Any anticipation?
It depends on how it's enforced and what incentives or punishments, if you like, to make it happen. You know, I think that, you know, you need real life cycle analysis on plastics, so that, you know, ideally the polymer producer is responsible for the plastic bag in the Indonesian river, right? But not just the polymer producer, but the brand owner and the local authorities and the public as well. So I don't see much impact unless it has teeth.
Yes, I was quite disappointed that there was very little detail and no binding targets came out of the most recent meeting on that plastics treaty. They really need to advance it if they want to give it any teeth.
Yeah.
The negotiations are due to continue, right? And maybe that is the next step. Okay, what will be the role of chemical distributors in Europe? All manufacturers are moving away.
Well, I mean, they could actually help to fill the gap, couldn't they? If the chemical manufacturing declines in Europe, there'll be a much bigger need for imports from elsewhere. So, you know, especially the global distributors are in a brilliant position to take advantage of that and import competitively priced materials from, you know, especially from Asia and China. And I think some of the big distributors I've spoken to are already doing that. They're already taking advantage of that trend.
I think, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was thinking about that in terms of the volatility of markets. You know, incredible. Because I mean, distributors are providers of information, aren't they? So does that become more important for distributors? How they, you know, help their customers understand markets, perhaps? Yeah. Don't know. Because I know some of the big distributors do that, don't they? They're sort of very much market intelligence providers.
Okay. And then the last question, we still receive questions, but sorry, I think we're already over time. So thanks for everyone who is so interested. Last question for today. So John, what do you think are the super major companies, super major scenarios, implications for EU distributors? And could you specify between specialty and commodity?
I think specialty, there's still an opportunity there, right? Because what will depend on what you define as a specialty, of course. But you know, if you can higher value grades of polymers down to real pure specialty chemicals, which won't be made in big quantities in the Middle East, and hopefully, I mean, China's a long way from being an exporter of higher value stuff. Maybe polyurethanes is different. Most of the value chains, if they do export, will be commodities. So that's clearly an opportunity. I think, as Will said as well, I mean, stuff will still need to be distributed, won't it? You know, even the lower value stuff coming in from potentially overseas. Yeah.
And these super majors are not going to be bothering about smaller customers, are they? So it could be a massive opportunity for distributors if they do.
Because some of these distributors have got thousands and thousands of really small customers, haven't they? As you know, Dorothy. Yeah. Well known. So that could be the opportunity, servicing those customers. Yeah.
Okay. So opportunity is the word to close, because we are already over time and we have stressed. We'll John now with a lot of questions. There are still questions in the pipeline. I'm afraid we have to really close it now, because otherwise we might continue for another hour. And I think possibly it's better to re-invite Will and John for another webinar, which is very popular and always very valuable. So many, many thanks to both of you. For everyone who we have left at home now in full depression, opportunities are always there. And I would like to say, also from my own experience, we have a lot of decades, I'd say decades of European strategies how to deal with transformation. That has always been an issue in Europe as long as I can remember. So I think if somebody's used to adapt to challenges and changes, then it's the European chemical industry. So it should not all be doom and gloom. And I think both of you mentioned some of the consequences of the positive side, where there are opportunities. And we will explore more of those, and also the innovation potential also in our Congress. So many, many thanks for today to both of you. Extremely insightful, and to be continued at another place, another time. For now, many, many thanks to everybody who listened in, to all the people who send us so interesting questions, and to Diana, our own Diana, who's running the show technically in the background. Many, many thanks, and stay tuned for more events and more insights. Bye.